He raised his hat and shouted, "Hurrah, boys, we've got them." But an hour later, every one of them would be dead, scalped, mutilated, left to rot in the dust of the Black Hills. George Custer had believed himself invincible, a golden-haired war hero sent to tame the frontier. But what he walked into wasn't a battlefield, it was a trap. And what followed introduced George Armstrong Custer, his mythos, his fame from the Civil War, and his fatal flaw, an obsession with glory. Teased the larger context, U.S. expansion, broken treaties, and the Lakota's refusal to surrender their way of life. Posed the central question, was this arrogance, betrayal, or simply karma? The wind howled across the plains like a thing alive, whipping George Armstrong Custer's golden curls as he stood atop the ridge, his blue eyes scanning the horizon. At 23, he had been the youngest general in the Union Army, a hero whose name still made Southerners spit in the dirt. Now at 38, he was a man out of time, his glory fading like the gilded edges of his Civil War reputation. The Indian Wars were a dirty, inglorious business, no grand charges, no cheering crowds, but Custer saw in them one last chance to carve his name into history. His fingers tightened around the reins of his stallion, Vic. The Cheyenne village below was quiet, unaware of the storm about to break upon them. "Remember, Wakita," he muttered to himself, the words a dark promise. The attack came at dawn. Bugles shattered the stillness, followed by the thunder of hooves as Custer's 7th Cavalry descended like wolves. Women screamed, dragging children into the tall grass. Old men reached for weapons they would never have time to fire. Custer's saber flashed in the pale light, his voice ringing out above the chaos. "Kill them all." The village burned, the smoke staining the sky black. When the dust settled, the bodies of women and children lay scattered among the ruins, their scalps taken as trophies by overeager troopers. Back at Fort Dodge, Custer strutted before the reporters, his uniform immaculate, his smile dazzling. "Another victory for civilization," he declared, ignoring the way Major Marcus Reno's jaw clenched at the words. Behind him, Captain Frederick Benteen spat into the dirt, his eyes dark with disgust. The cracks were forming. Custer didn't see them. He was too busy basking in the glow of his own legend, too consumed by the need to prove himself once more. When the orders came, an expedition into the Black Hills to crush the hostile Lakota and their defiant leader Sitting Bull, he all but snatched them from his commanding officer's hands. As the 7th Cavalry rode out, their guidons snapping in the wind, Custer turned in his saddle, grinning. This will be our greatest triumph yet. Far ahead, hidden in the rolling hills, a Lakota scout watched the column approach. He turned his pony and vanished into the tall grass, carrying a warning to his people. "They are coming." The Black Hills breathed gold, and the white men came like locusts. Sitting Bull stood motionless on the plains, his face turned toward the sacred Paha Sapa, as the wind carried the stench of sweat and greed from the miners' camps. The Fort Laramie Treaty had promised these lands to the Lakota forever, but forever had lasted barely 8 years before the whispers of gold turned into a flood of pickaxes and rifles. The government offered money, demanded signatures, sent soldiers to enforce their lies. Sitting Bull refused to bend. His hands would never touch the pen. His voice, when he spoke to the Indian agents, was iron wrapped in smoke. "You are thieves. These hills are not yours to sell." That night, beneath a sky sown with stars, Sitting Bull danced until his feet bled. The Sundance pole stood like a spine piercing the earth, the ropes through his flesh anchoring him to the visions. When he collapsed at dawn, his lips cracked with thirst, his eyes burned with what he had seen. Soldiers falling from the sky like grasshoppers, their blue coats swallowed by dust and blood. The holy men nodded. The people whispered. Crazy Horse sharpened his war club and said nothing at all. Meanwhile, Custer's expedition rolled west like a traveling circus. Reporters trailed the 7th Cavalry, their pencils poised to immortalize the great Indian fighter's latest triumph. Custer reveled in it, posing for photographs with his brothers Tom and Boston, his boyish grin belying the tension in his officers' faces. Major Reno drank openly, his flask never far from his lips. Captain Benteen watched the horizon with the grim focus of a man who knew what waited in the tall grass. The troopers, many of them raw recruits, joked and gambled, unaware they were being led into the belly of the gathering storm. On June 17, 1876, General Crook's forces clashed with Crazy Horse at Rosebud Creek. The battle raged for 6 hours, Crook's men retreating in disarray, their dead left behind. The news never reached Custer. His scouts, Arikara and Crow warriors whose distrust of the Lakota ran deep, brought whispers of a massive encampment along the Little Bighorn, but Custer dismissed them. "Indians don't gather in such numbers," he scoffed. his Civil War arrogance blinding him to the truth, taking shape just beyond the next ridge. The Lakota and Cheyenne camps stretched for miles along the river, over 8,000 strong, a city of lodges rising from the prairie like a mirage. Women tended cooking fires. Children raced between the pony herds. Warriors painted themselves for war, their faces streaked with ochre and ash. Sitting Bull moved among them, his presence a quiet flame. Crazy Horse prepared his ambush, his tactics honed by years of fighting the Wasichu. They knew the soldiers were coming. They were ready. On the morning of June 25th, Custer crested a low rise and reined in sharply. Below him the valley simmered with the smoke of countless lodges. His breath caught. Not a village, a nation. For a heartbeat, doubt flickered across his face. Then it was gone, swallowed by the old familiar hunger. He raised his hat, his voice ringing out like a trumpet call. "Hurrah, boys, we've got them." Behind him his men cheered. None saw the flash of movement in the grass, the first of Crazy Horse's scouts melting away to sound the alarm. The valley erupted in chaos before Custer's order to attack had fully left his lips. Reno's detachment charged the southern end of the encampment first, sabers gleaming in the midday sun as they tore through the outer ring of lodges. But what began as a cavalry charge quickly dissolved into madness. Lakota women screamed warnings as warriors streamed from their teepees, rifles and bows already in hand. Bloody Knife, Custer's Arikara scout, turned to Reno with panic in his eyes just before a bullet shattered his skull, spraying brain matter across the major's face. The metallic stench of blood mixed with the sour tang of whiskey on Reno's breath as he shouted the retreat, his men scrambling back across the river in disarray. On the bluffs above, Benteen's company watched Reno's shattered forces crawl up the slope like wounded animals. The captain's hand tightened around his field glasses as he took in the sheer size of the village below, not the scattered band of warriors they'd been promised, but an ocean of tippies stretching farther than the eye could see. "My God," his lieutenant whispered, "there must be thousands of them." Benteen's reply was lost in the wind. Custer pressed forward without waiting for reinforcements. The general's golden curls streamed behind him as Vic pounded across the uneven ground, his brothers Tom and Boston struggling to keep pace. The staccato rhythm of gunfire from Reno's engagement faded behind them as they approached the northern end of the village. Here the land rose in two distinct hills, Calhoun Hill and the steeper Last Stand Hill beyond. Custer's lips pulled back from his teeth in something between a grin and a grimace as he signaled the split of his remaining forces. The first arrows came from nowhere, slicing through the blue-coated troopers with terrifying precision. Then the ground itself seemed to move as hundreds of warriors emerged from hidden gullies and ravines. Gall's Hunkpapa Lakota swarmed Calhoun Hill while Crazy Horse's Oglala flanked from the west, their war cries rising above the panicked whinnies of cavalry horses. A young trooper clutched at an arrow protruding from his throat, his scream bubbling into silence as he toppled from his saddle. The battle dissolved into a series of nightmarish tableaus. On Calhoun Hill, Keogh's company formed desperate defensive lines that shrank with each passing minute. Troopers fired blindly into the dust-choked air, their bullets finding more comrades than enemies in the confusion. The heat became unbearable, a physical weight pressing down as gun barrels overheated and ammunition dwindled. Custer's younger brother Tom emptied his revolver again and again, his face splattered with blood that might have been friend or foe. On Last Stand Hill, George Custer finally understood. His remaining men clustered around him in a shrinking circle, their backs to each other as the Lakota and Cheyenne closed in from all sides. The general's pristine uniform was now filthy with dust and gunpowder, his famous golden locks matted with sweat. For the first time in his charmed life, George Armstrong Custer knew true fear. The realization flashed across his face moments before Crazy Horse's warriors crested the ridge, their war clubs gleaming in the afternoon sun. Back on Reno Hill, the survivors listened helplessly. The distant gunfire from Custer's position rose to a frenzied crescendo before suddenly, terribly, falling silent. Benteen met Reno's bloodshot eyes across their makeshift barricade of dead horses and supply boxes. Neither spoke. The afternoon heat pressed down like a physical presence, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the occasional crack of a sniper's bullet. Somewhere below, the victorious Lakota began singing their death songs. As dusk painted the battlefield in long shadows, a young private turned to Benteen, his voice cracking. "Sir, where is General Custer?" The captain stared north toward the ominous quiet of Last Stand Hill, his face unreadable. The answer, when it came, would shake a nation to its core. The gun smoke hung thick over the battlefield as the last of Custer's men fell back toward the shallow crest of the hill. The grass, once green and swaying, was trampled into bloody mud beneath the hooves of panicked horses and the moccasined feet of advancing warriors. Custer's remaining troopers, fewer than 60 now, fought in desperate clusters, their ammunition nearly spent, their faces streaked with sweat and black powder. The general himself stood at the center, his ivory-handled revolvers empty, his famous golden curls matted with dirt and blood. His lips moved soundlessly, as if reciting some long-forgotten prayer, or perhaps still whispering the words that had brought them here. "Hurrah, boys, we've got them." A bullet struck his brother Tom in the chest, sending him sprawling into the dust. Custer couldn't look. Instead, he reached for the saber he hadn't drawn since the Civil War, its blade flashing dully in the fading light. Around him, the surviving troopers formed a ragged circle, their bayonets fixed, their eyes wide with the animal terror of men who knew they were already dead. The Lakota and Cheyenne came like a wave. Crazy Horse led the final charge, his war club swinging in deadly arcs, his voice rising above the chaos. Gauls' warriors poured in from the flanks, their rifles spitting fire. The air itself seemed to vibrate with the screams of dying horses, the war cries of triumphant warriors, the last choked curses of the fallen. A young trooper, barely 18, clutched his stomach as his intestines spilled through his fingers. Another fell to his knees, his hands raised in surrender before a warrior's bullet sent him toppling backward. Custer's circle shrank with each passing second, the ground beneath them slick with blood and spent cartridges. Then silence, not the absence of sound but the sudden suffocating weight of it. The gunfire ceased, the war cries faded, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Custer stood alone now, his saber trembling in his grip, his blue eyes scanning the ring of warriors closing in around him. For the first time in his life, there was no audience left to perform for, no reporters, no adoring crowds, no history books waiting to immortalize his deeds. There was only the dirt, the blood, and the faces of the men who had come to kill him. The first bullet struck him high in the chest, spinning him halfway around. The second hit his thigh, sending him crashing to one knee. The third, fired point blank by a Cheyenne warrior named Brave Bear, entered just below his left ribs and tore upward through his heart. Custer's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His saber slipped from his fingers, its blade scoring a thin line in the dirt before coming to rest beside the body of his brother Boston. The last thing he saw was the sky, endless and blue, the same color as his uniform before the darkness took him. On Reno Hill, 2 miles away, Captain Benteen lowered his field glasses. He didn't need them to know what the sudden silence meant. Around him, the survivors of Reno's shattered command huddled behind their makeshift barricades, their faces hollow with exhaustion and fear. A private opened his mouth to speak, but Benteen silenced him with a look. There were no words left. The killing wasn't over. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the victorious warriors turned their attention to the bodies littering the battlefield. Custer's corpse was stripped naked, his ears punctured to mock his failed hearing of the Lakota warnings, his thighs slashed open in tribute to the many buffalo he had slaughtered. Tom Custer's body was mutilated beyond recognition, a final revenge for his role in the Washita massacre. The dead troopers were left where they fell, their bodies bloating in the summer heat, their faces frozen in expressions of shock and disbelief. 3 days later, General Terry's column arrived to find the horror waiting for them. The stench hit first, thick and sweet, the smell of death on an unimaginable scale, then the flies, rising in black clouds from the corpses, and finally the silence. No triumphant war cries, no defiant last stands, just the wind whispering through the grass, and the distant mocking call of a crow. Somewhere beneath that terrible quiet, the myth of George Armstrong Custer, the golden-haired hero, the unbeatable general, lay dead and rotting in the dirt.